Yeah.
Everybody, good afternoon. My name is Naomi Chen. I am the president of the Public Health Society. We are an organization that provides professional and personal development in the public health field. So if you are wanting to be proactive, or the active here, feel free to contact us. I want to extend my gratitude to all of you, faculty, the students, the alumni for coming today and joining us for the event for the spring. And I also want to express my gratitude to our esteemed guest speaker, Sammy Roth. Thank you so much for joining us today. And before I introduce Dr. Zellman, there is a sign-in sheet going around, so please put your name down, your professor, class that you want. For Dr. Zellman, who is our public department chair.
Everybody, pleased to be here. Glad you could all come. Very excited. This is our third year of running what we call the book read. Over here. This will be our third year running what we call the book read. In which the department selects the book, and then we hold a series of events around the book, in class. It's the third time we're doing it, and we've got a great book here from Greta Thunberg, the Swedish environmental activist. Book of essays, and great. Maybe there it is. This is
It's large.
It's large. I want to thank you all for coming and sit and watch. And I'm going to turn it over to Greg Stevens, Professor Greg Stevens, who runs this program for us. He has created it, and most of you will all get a book. Tell them that. Anyway,
I'm about to.
You're about to. I'm not
Stealing my thought.
This is it.
Okay, good.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Zellman. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see very many familiar faces here from classes and from and online people who are alumni from our program. If there's any obvious alumni on the screen right now, can you just wave your hands? We've got their cameras on. Yay, good. Hi, Sheila. Wonderful. And Kalicia's there. Great. There'll be a bunch of folks there. So we've got a really unique setup tonight. They can see you. We can see them. The whole idea behind this kind of broadcast setup is so that we feel like we're building community here at this institution. It's something that we desperately need because we still kind of have a commuter campus reputation. So having faces here in person really matters. So thank you, all of you, for being here in person. Thank you, everybody, for being online. So I'm excited to lead today's event with Sammy Roth. Not only is climate change an important issue for public health, but it's probably the most important public health issue of our time. It's also the most pressing issue. In other words, time is short. So to galvanize action, we need all hands on deck. And that's what we're doing with this book read program. We're lucky to have Sammy Roth here to help us kick off this book read event. I can't think of a more perfect person to speak with us, given that he has such an interesting range of perspectives and ideas that he presents as an LA Times climate columnist and through his Boiling Point newsletter. If you haven't already signed up for his newsletter, we're going to make it easy for you to do that. You can check with the RSVP sign, and we provided a link to enroll in the Boiling Point newsletter. So before I get to him, once I'm going to introduce Dr. Alvarez. I think everybody knows Dr. Evelyn Alvarez. She is one of our department's treasurers here at Cal State LA. She's a scientist by training, but a professor by heart. She teaches all of our environmental health courses, and she's equally comfortable leading the tree plantings on campus, holding clothing swaps, and creating our department's first free public health library. We're having the kickoff event for that is December 4th.
Yes, on Monday, December 4th.
Monday, December 4th. Okay, so there's flyers up about that. I hope everybody comes to the red ribbon cutting for that. We've already filled it to the brim with public health books. So if you're interested in picking up something to read or you will have something to drop off, come and do that. Okay, so this is Dr. Alvarez. Oh, and I forgot to mention, she's the recipient of a national research grant on environmental. So this is no small accomplishment for a young faculty. So we're lucky to have you. And thank you for being here today.
Having me.
now to Sammy Roth. Okay, so let's see. I think most of you have heard of Sammy Roth, if not just because of me describing him to you, but I know some of you have been reading his work for a while. He's the climate columnist for this little-known newspaper called the LA Times, and he writes this impactful newsletter called Boiling Point. Let's see. You know, he's written with equal style about electric utilities, politics with Gavin Newsom, solar desert plants, and even today, I think Smokey the Bear.
Yep. Which I learned is actually just Smokey Bear. There's no the.
There's no
believe it or
the.
not. Yeah. That was a shock to me.
That's shocking.
Yeah.
It changes like my worldview.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So one thing that he's asked us to consider recently is being a little bit more as environmentalists, bending and compromising a bit further in order to make meaningful action on climate change. And so it's something we're going to talk with him about today. He's the perfect person to help us get it warmed up for our spring event. And we're going to engage him in a little dialogue. So we'll start with questions here. And we'll go to the audience, then we'll even take some questions from people online. So first of all, please welcome me and join me in welcoming Sammy Roth.
No, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm happy to be here. It seems like you guys have a great program, and so I'm excited to be able to hopefully contribute a little bit. And thank you for telling everyone about the sign up for Boiling Point. I have an obligation to my employer to share this. If you get bored while we're talking and want to just go onto your phone, if you're interested, latimes.com/boiling point is the place where folks can sign up. But thank you.
Well, good,
Yeah.
good. Okay, well, I'm going to kick off with one question that I've been sort of thinking about this event, but mostly thinking about you as a journalist. And so I wanted to ask you, when you meet new people, and you tell them that you're a climate columnist for the LA Times, what's their reaction?
Well, I would say that probably the main one that I get that's been recurring over the years is some form of, wow, that sounds depressing. How do you deal with that? You know, you tell people you write about climate change, and, you know, outside of a very small segment of the public that denies the reality of climate change, for the most part, people correctly associate it with doom and gloom and heat waves and wildfires and drought and sea level rise and worsening storms and climate refugees and all sorts of really terrible stuff. So you say you write about this for a living, and they're like, oh, how do you deal with that? And it's a good question. And I think typically my answer to it is that climate change can feel big and overwhelming. It can feel like too much for any of us to sort of wrap our minds around or do anything about. But the thing that kind of keeps me, I don't know if hopeful is the right word, but the thing that kind of powers me through and helps me deal with the depressing and overwhelming nature of it is feeling like, okay, at least I'm doing my small part here. I mean, for all of us with climate change, whatever involvement we might want to have with trying to solve it, nobody's going to do everything. You know, every city needs to be involved, every state, every nation, every community, every household, even every company. So, you know, for me, my involvement is I get to write about it as a journalist. And so I feel like, okay, I could spend my time being depressed by this, but at least I know I'm doing my part, I'm making my contribution. That's the kind of thing that helps me cope day to day. And I hope that works for others. It's not going to be the thing that does it for everybody, but that's what helps me stay reasonably, again, not hopeful, but, you know, like at least I'm trying. At least I'm not throwing up my hands in despair.
Yeah, and it's a good point that we can't do it all ourselves. We do as much, and part of it's just probably spreading information about the seriousness of climate change.
Yeah, and you know, almost no matter what I write, I'll get people who sort of crankily email me and say, you know, people who either they don't like the idea of maybe their electricity rates might go up to have to pay for cleaner energy, or they don't like the idea of having to eat less meat, or politically they don't like you're having to drive less potentially, or to take public transit more, or they don't like the idea that the United States should be on the hook for leading the way, you know, although arguably we should, because we've emitted more than any other country historically. And they'll email me and go, oh, you know, that's such a small part of the problem. You know, everyone could do that thing, or the United States could do all of this, and it would only deal with, you know, 0.1% of emissions, or 1% of emissions, or 2% of emissions, and we'd still have this big problem. That's true of everything. that's true of every step on climate change. So so yeah, I get that it's all small stuff, but there's no other way to get to something big than lots of small stuff adding up. So that does help keep me going too.
And in your role as a journalist, I think too, must be that you have some responsibility for kind of educating the public about climate change. I mean, the public health has a role in all of this too, that we're, the research end of things probably, and also some of the education and prevention roles. But the communication side, that must be sort of a big burden as a journalist, knowing that probably most people are learning about climate change, not from public health professionals, but from the folks who are interpreting all of this data for us.
Well, I wish everyone was learning from not only from public health experts like you guys, but from journalists. I mean, so much of what I grapple with that does kind of frustrate and depress me all the time is knowing how there's just many fewer people reading and believing journalists and newspapers than there used to be. There's so much distrust in the media, some of which is for various reasons earned and deserved, but there's so much good environmental journalism happening, and I wish more people were reading the work we're doing and taking it to heart and trying to act based on it. But no, it feels less like a burden and more like a very lucky opportunity that I have, that I'm in a position where this is something that I care about, that's personally very meaningful for me. I mean, I'm 31 years old. I hope to be living on this planet for a long time. I want the world to be safe for me and for eventually my children and grandchildren and whatnot. But I feel like, great, I have this chance that at least there's some segment of folks out there that are reading this and taking it seriously and might decide how to vote, or decide what to bring up at the Thanksgiving dinner table, or decide what kind of car to drive, or how to get around based on some of the stuff that I write. So that's a huge opportunity that I hope to use wisely.
Thank you for that.
All right, so let's jump into this head first, Sammy. So what do you think is the most important thing we should all know about climate change? So for example, what do you think we should be paying particular attention to in the next year or two?
Gosh, I think I have two answers to that question, one of which is more pertinent to the next year or two part, and the second point is kind of the opposite of that, but they kind of go together. The thing that I find myself going back to again and again these days in just about every story I write is just how important it is to move really, really quickly, how little time there is left right now. I mean, the nations of the world that, the Paris Agreement and whatnot have all come to the conclusion that, based on the work of thousands of scientists all over the place, that we have to try really, really hard to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we can help it, and 2 degrees Celsius if we can't quite reach 1.5. That those are points past which, as bad as things are now and are likely to get in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that beyond that it would be much, much worse. Just last week, the United Nations came out with its latest sort of estimation of what that would take to keep things to 1.5 Celsius. And what they found is that we would need to cut carbon emissions by 43% globally by 2030, which is like kind of crazy when you think about it. That's 7 years from now. I mean, it's already been, gosh, almost 8 years since the Paris Agreement. God, that was December 2015, I think.
Right.
And meanwhile, we're talking about less time than that, and we've got to cut global emissions, almost in half to have a chance of keeping to 1.5 Celsius. I mean, that's insane. And we can get into more detail on this later in the conversation if you want, but I'm writing all the time about what does it take to build the clean energy capacity that we need to defeat get fossil fuels out of the system, and how quickly we need to expand the electric grid and build lots of solar and wind and get electric vehicles onto the road and build out public transit and get electric heat pumps into people's homes and change the way we eat, and all of these big systems. Like, God, cutting in half in 7 years is just insane. So, got to move fast, really, really fast is number one. The second point that's kind of the opposite of that, but sort of the same, is that I sort of, going back to the despair thing, I also hear from people all the time who just kind of throw up their hands, and understandably, and say, hey, we're never going to get this done. Like, we have to adapt as best we can and hope it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be, and just accept that this much global warming is coming and that we've got to deal with it. There's nothing we can do to stop it. We're never going to stay to 1.5. We're never going to stay to 2 Celsius. By the way, I'm going to cut in and interrupt myself there. I meant to say, I don't know if anyone saw this news, but just last week, forget if it was this weekend or the previous weekend, there was actually 2 days in a row measured where the world was in fact 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. It was the first time that it had ever been measured. That's one day, you know, I mean, the goals we're having globally are, you know, trying to avoid that on like an annual basis. But I mean, that's kind of crazy that we're, you know, already even at the fringes hitting that a day or two at a time. But anyway, but the sort of opposite of that is that, so people throw up their hands and say, we're never going to do it. What's the point of even trying? Well, every little bit of warming that we avoid is really, really beneficial. I mean, when you look at just the huge global consequences of this playing out, the, you know, the millions of people who are, you know, likely to die from heat waves and water shortages and all of the other myriad consequences of climate change. You know, 2.1 degrees is a hell of a lot better than 2.2 degrees, is a lot better than 2.25, is a lot better than 2.3, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, what I always say to those people is, yeah, I very badly don't want to find out what a world worse than 2 Celsius is like, but I'd still much prefer 2 to 2.5 to 3 to 3.5, et cetera. So there's, you know, people talk about tipping points. There might be points at which some impacts become irreversible, melting of ice sheets. That would be bad, but still, the less warming, the better would be the main thing I would say there.
And just as a follow-up to that, you know, part of my research agenda is to include underrepresented narratives in this climate change dialogue, and offering the possibility of being sustainable to our local inner city communities. So we do a lot of that kind of stuff in my classroom, and we take sustainability campus tours to kind of understand what the campus is doing to become more sustainable. What are some things from your perspective that that students can do to lower their carbon and ecological footprint?
Really good question. I think in terms of, so I guess a couple different ways I might approach that question. One, and I know I've said this several times already, but just how we get around is such an important thing. Transportation is the biggest source of emissions in the United States. It's by far the biggest source of emissions in California. Something like 40% of greenhouse gases in California come from, you know, cars, trucks, and other forms of transportation. So, you know, to the extent that you may be driving a gasoline car and could switch to electric, or to the extent you could spend more time taking the, you know, the metro or taking buses, that's a huge help. But I think what that dovetails into is just the idea of a carbon footprint or ecological footprint, as you said. It's an important concept, and there's definitely like a ton that, you know, those of us as individuals and as consumers of energy can do to, you know, help this cause. And it's transportation. It's, you know, if we are lucky enough to be able to own a home and to be able to afford it, putting solar power on our roofs. It's again, how we heat our homes, how we eat, et cetera. But what I always tell people is that the biggest thing we can all be doing is working towards political change. It's, you know, whether it's on campus, that's lobbying administrators who, you know, can make bigger decisions about how the university spends money and where it gets its energy, to the extent that you can be involved in helping to elect politicians who make this a priority, even if they're not perfect and even if they're not in line with everything that we need, because very few of them are. You know, the idea of a carbon footprint, it was actually a concept that was, and maybe you guys are aware of this, but it was popularized by a BP, by the oil company, as a way of shifting responsibility from the fossil fuel industry onto those of us as individuals, and kind of saying, hey, well, you're pointing at us, but it's really all your fault. You're the ones who are out there driving cars and consuming oil and consuming gas, and we're just your servant in this. So definitely important to think about our own footprints, but I always like to try to make sure that doesn't get lost in that the most important thing we can all be doing as individuals is helping motivate larger, you know, systemic corporate and political change, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just as before I forget, I wanted to get your opinions on hydrogen, because our campus,
Yeah.
we are the only college campus in the nation to host a hydrogen fueling station.
Interesting.
So I was wondering what your thoughts on that.
That's really thing. And now I'm curious, what do you use hydrogen for here?
Oh, so for
For vehicles? Okay.
yeah. Wave cars.
Okay. Hydrogen is so interesting. For those who may not be following the hydrogen story, there's been a lot of momentum around hydrogen recently as a way to sort of do some of the things that solar and wind can't do and that electricity can't do. So for heavy industry that needs fuel of some kind, for whom electricity can't get them to the temperatures they need, potentially for heavy duty trucks, for whom electric vehicle, batteries might not take them as far as they need to go, potentially as a fuel to use in the home, maybe, or as a fuel to plug into power plants rather than burning natural gas. Maybe you burn hydrogen instead. There's been a lot of momentum around it, in part because the oil and gas industry sees hydrogen as more of a natural pivot for themselves, I would say. They can use the infrastructure they've already got, or the types of infrastructure they're used to building, like pipelines and storage tanks. They see it sort of as an easier way to keep making money than to risk getting left behind in the shift to renewable energy and to electrifying everything. And the Biden administration has gotten on board with hydrogen in a lot of ways too. I've been writing about this recently. There was a bunch of money for hydrogen in the bipartisan infrastructure law a couple of years ago, and I think some in the Inflation Reduction Act, the big climate bill as well. And the Biden folks just came out with a couple of billions of dollars to fund different hydrogen hubs in different parts of the country, including one in California, where there's going to be a lot of research and investment into the fuel. The flip side of that, hydrogen is really controversial because most of the hydrogen in use today is generated via very polluting, emissive processes. They call it, there's all color schemes, gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. That most of the stuff that's produced today comes from fossil fuels and creates a lot of emissions. There's a lot of discussion around transferring to green hydrogen. So using solar or wind or other renewable electricity to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and using that hydrogen for good stuff. That's what California is focused on. Some of the other states that just got these big Biden administration hydrogen hub grants are working with some of the dirtier stuff, which seems like less of a good idea. In the environmental community, I would say there's a lot of skepticism that hydrogen is just going to be an excuse for the oil and gas industry to keep mostly investing in oil and gas and spending a little bit on hydrogen and then mostly producing it in this still polluting form that doesn't actually get at solving the climate problem, and that that green hydrogen is never going to work out. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too technically complex. Moral of the story, there's a lot of debate in this area. I guess where I would come down on it, and that's interesting that you have the fueling stations here, because there was a time 15 or 20 years ago when the state of California was, actually they still are investing money in this, but before electric vehicles really started to come down in price, the big focus in California at the Sacramento level for cleaning up transportation was invest in hydrogen fueling stations. It's been 15 years. There's maybe a couple thousand hydrogen vehicles on the road in the state.
Does anybody in this room have a hydrogen vehicle?
It's a really small number, and so it just hasn't taken off. But I guess where I would come down is that most of the research on how do we get rid of fossil fuels and how do we do that while continuing to operate the economy. Most of that research finds that we could probably cut out 80 or 90% of the fossil fuels that we burn today with the technologies we have now that are cost effective, mostly on the backs of solar and wind and batteries, and a couple of other things, energy efficiency being a big part of it too. How do we do that last 10 or 20%? That's, there's a lot more debate and discussion there. Hydrogen, green hydrogen is one of the technologies I think that could help bridge that gap. It's not the only one. There's a lot of debate about geothermal and nuclear and carbon capture and storage and, all sorts of other stuff that could, potentially help fill in that gap. It would be great if green hydrogen was one of those things. I think it's yet to be seen how effective and how realistic that's going to be. Do what I think. I don't know. What do you think?
So I find the conversation on hydrogen really, really interesting. And we have one of my honors advisees is an expert on hydrogen, and he actually works at the hydrogen station. So maybe he can ask a question later on, fill us in on his thoughts.
I'd be interested in that.
Yeah.
What? I feel like we're getting a little bit in the weeds very quick.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's okay. Again, it's what we brought you here for. But at the same time, I'd like to kind of pull out and be like big picture again. And the timing of this event is kind of amazing because this is also the first day of COP28, right? This is the gathering of nations to work on climate change issues. And they read this morning there's something like 100,000 delegates attending this COP28. It's based in Dubai, which I think is somewhat controversial. Given it's a fossil
Yes.
fuel state, right?
And that the conference is being led by the head of Dubai's national oil company, one of the biggest oil companies in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little, so I guess I'm interested in your take on that. And I want, I don't want to focus too much on the scandal, even though the scandal's interesting. But I mean, what could really come out of this?
That's a good question. I guess what I would start by saying is that I personally don't focus so much on global climate politics and affairs, just because, and there's a lot of reporters who do, and it's fabulous that they do. We need to keep it in mind. As I said earlier, so much of solving climate change is going to come down to what happens at the local, the state, the national level. And that's where I personally feel like I can have the greatest impact by writing about those issues that are, more locally relevant rather than trying to influence global affairs. So that's why I haven't written about it as much. That said, obviously super important.
Well, there must be hundreds of California delegates
Oh yeah.
at this as well.
So Governor Newsom isn't at this one. He's been there a bunch of times in the past, but the state has still sent, I think, a couple dozen state lawmakers and state cabinet members and all sorts of others. I think I saw that Vice President Harris is going to be there too.
I saw that too. Yes.
Yeah, Biden isn't, but Vice President is. I'm a little bit of two minds about the Conference of the Parties. On the one hand, it can feel a little bit like navel gazing some of the time. Like, you've got all of these international leaders coming together to argue with each other and, make very high level promises that, oh yeah, we'll try to do better. We'll set these targets. We'll, promise to send money to developing nations that are suffering the impacts of climate change the most from pollution that was mostly emitted by wealthy nations. And we're going to promise them that money and then be very slow about giving it to them, or maybe not ever give it to them to be seen. There've been a lot of promises made and not yet filled. So and everyone's flying to get there and all of this stuff. So it can feel a little bit like, what's the point? But at the same time, I mean, it's certainly important as an accountability exercise. I mean, the fact that the Paris Agreement in 2015 has become so embedded, I think, in like the psyche of people who are paying attention to this stuff, and sort of become a tool or a cudgel for people, climate activists and voters and people who care about this stuff to try to hold their national leaders accountable of, hey, you guys promised that you're going to try to keep this to 2 degrees and that you're going to cut emissions by this much by this date. And national climate pledges have come out of it. So I think it's useful as an accountability tool. And I was reading a piece, another really excellent climate newsletter is Heated. I don't know if any of you read Heated by the journalist Emily Atkin, but she had a really good piece earlier this week where she basically wrote that she had been planning to write a column, sort of expressing her frustration with the Dubai conference and what a farce it was and how this wasn't going to lead to anything important, but that the more she researched it and the more people she talked to and the more that she focused on it, the more she realized, well, it's easy for me to say that as a resident of the developed world who lives in, a relatively wealthy place in a relatively wealthy nation. And I'm, especially for the nations of the global South, like this isn't something that they can just throw up their hands with in frustration. Like they really need to take this seriously and try to extract everything they can out of the, wealthier countries and hope that we live up to our promises. So it's really important for that reason. I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Actually, I'm thinking it might help if you could give us just the briefest overview of what the Paris Climate Agreement was.
Yeah.
Without a lot of detail, but just sort of big picture.
Yeah, I mean, the big picture, I couldn't go into that much detail, but basically it was every country in the world agreed we're going to try to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That was a target that scientists had been emphasizing for a long time as, really, really, we should try not to get past that point. And somehow or another, every country agreed on that in Paris in 2015. So there's more to it than that, but that's the important.
So that's the agreement.
Yeah, and that's that's average temperatures relative to like pre-1750 global averages.
That's kind of where the 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, they set 1.5 degrees as like a above and beyond. We'd like to try to reach that. And then I think it was in 2018 or 19 that they sort of even drilled down even harder on the 1.5 and said, really, we'll try to get there. And right now we're at about 1.1, which is still a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I know 1.1 doesn't sound like a lot. Probably everyone here is aware of this, but like a 1 degree average increase Celsius in global temperatures, that's more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you look at like the bell curve of the temperature distribution, I mean, a 1 degree shift in the average means those bad heat waves, which are the ones that really kill people and cause problems, I mean, those just go off the charts, not to mention all of the other cascading impacts of more heat.
I guess, and it also reminds us that we're really close to that 1.5 degree.
I mean, like I said, 7 years cutting emissions in half, that's like nuts. I mean, I hope we can do it, but it's nuts. Oh.
Yeah, we definitely check out those IPCC curves in class and look at the worst case and best case scenarios. So let's pull back a bit, Sammy.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved in climate reporting, and what was it that appealed to you the most about being a climate columnist?
So like you all, I studied climate change in college. So that's great that everyone's doing that. That's how you get started. No, I studied sustainable development. That was my major. I kind of got into it, I think, because frankly, I was a little bit of a political junkie in college and as a teenager, and it just climate change. This is, like the mid to late 2000s and early 2010s. It felt like this is such an obvious one politically. Like, how is it that our two-party system hasn't come to agreement on this? So I just started to sort of go more and more down that rabbit hole, and took classes in climate science and climate law and energy economics and all public health and chemistry and all sorts of stuff that contributes to this. So was studying that. I was an editor in my college newspaper and really wanted to be a journalist, so kind of put those two things together and was lucky enough to get a job out of college covering energy at the newspaper in Palm Springs, California, in the desert, a couple hours east of here. And that was actually a really lucky place to get started covering energy, because right as I was out there in the desert, like that was basically where the large scale solar industry was first taking off in the United States. Like this was like 2014, so almost 10 years ago, but a couple of the first really big solar projects in the country were just like opening out in the desert, like while I was working there. So, I was at like the groundbreaking ceremony for Desert Sunlight, which is just outside of Joshua Tree National Park. It was the biggest solar farm in the country when it opened at the beginning of 2015. There are a couple that are a little bigger now, but it's several thousand acres. It's 550 megawatts. That's a very large number of megawatts. For context, there's on a typical really hot day, California will use maybe as much as 50,000 megawatts, and this is 500 of them right there, 550 coming from this one solar field. So that was kind of a big deal. So I got kind of an early introduction to this industry. There's also all sorts of, if you ever driven on the 10 from here out to the desert, you've probably driven through all the wind turbines out there. That was like the birthplace of the US large scale wind industry as well in the 1970s and 80s. So I got super familiar with that super quickly. I don't know if anyone knows much about geothermal energy, but also one of those sort of important, how do we keep the lights on when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing? There's certain hot spots in the Western United States, especially where there's incredibly hot, superheated underground fluid that you can tap into for electricity, and it's renewable, and it can be 24 hours a day. So there's a really big geothermal area out in the desert that's poised for expansion that I got to write a lot about. So that was kind of my introduction to the renewable energy space. And yeah, I did that for a few years, came to the LA Times a few years ago, and actually just a month or two ago became the climate columnist, which is the first time we've had that position at the paper. Still pretty focused on energy because climate change is an energy story ultimately, at least in large part. But yeah, I've gotten to expand my horizons a little bit. You guys mentioned I wrote about Smokey Bear today, so that was kind of fun, and poking my head into some different areas now, but still energy at the heart of it.
Very cool. Yeah, our major is pretty interdisciplinary. So environmental health is one of the required core curriculum classes.
Cool.
That everybody has to take. But hopefully, one day we'll move towards the direction of having different tracks where students who really like environmental health can get a specialization in that.
I think one of the interesting things about climate change, and maybe this is relevant to people who are studying in this program, I mean, I know I'm not going to say anything you guys don't know here, but it's such an everything story. I mean, literally every aspect of our lives, there's a climate change angle to it. I mean, public health is such a big part of it. We haven't talked about this yet, but I mean, there's research showing that even aside from the greenhouse gas emissions impacts of burning fossil fuels, that millions of people die every year just from the regular old air pollution emitted by coal and oil and gas. So it's public health, it's how we build our cities and design our cities. It's transportation, it's, agriculture, it's the food we eat, it's the lifestyle and consumption choices we make, it's our politics. I mean, it's sports. For the first time this year, there were baseball games canceled due to wildfire smoke. I'm a huge huge Dodgers fan. I see a Dodgers hat here. Very nice. We're starting to have sporting events that are being affected by this. In fact, I've written about research into how can the major professional sports leagues reduce their emissions by rejiggering their schedules to not require quite as many cross-country plane flights. How can teams go from place to place more efficiently rather than Toronto to LA to Tampa and then back to St. Louis all the time. So it's really such an everything story. So I'm glad to hear there are going to be more ways for people to look into this as part of your program, because it's just so important.
Yeah. Yeah, we even had, I think, a goose or a duck that made some sort of, it was from a nature preserve that made an appearance at, I think it was a Dodgers game.
It was a Dodgers playoff game. I was there that night, actually. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Yep. Climate change is everywhere.
Exactly. Very, 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 an issue that transcends, I think, all boundaries.
Yep, for sure.
So you wrote a really beautiful article a couple of weeks back about the hope that people experience as they struggle with the realities of climate change. So you captured different quotes from people all over California. So I was wondering what resonated for you the most among these responses, and where do you find your own hope?
Well, yeah, so that was I enjoyed doing that piece, and that's been a sort of a Thanksgiving tradition in the last few years. So 2 years ago for Boiling Point, I asked some of my coworkers who write about the environment what gives them hope, and they contributed sort of little write-ups for the newsletter. And last year it was people who work in the environment professionally. I reached out to, and they're really in the trenches. And this year was a call out to readers. And I mean, I know this goes back to what I was saying earlier, but I think the thing that was most profound and most moving for me was just seeing the kind of hope that people could get out of the sort of what might feel small, but to the steps they're taking in their own lives. People tending local gardens of native plants, or people, seniors who have gone sort of, back to, there's a group called Third Act, I think, that several of the people who responded were involved with, people who are, in sort of the latter stages of their life and who may be retired, going back to, not to work, but, putting their time into activism surrounding climate to protect the next generations who, get a lot of value out of that. People who were planning at their Thanksgiving dinner table to bring up climate change and make sure that it was on the minds of their friends and family. That kind of thing was really inspiring for me. That it's not just that, oh, you have to be one of the delegates to the COP28 in Dubai, or that you have to be working for the Sierra Club necessarily, although great for those who are, but that people are really taking solace in the things in their daily lives. Yeah, that would have been my main takeaway. Did I answer the question? I hope.
Oh, yeah, you
Okay.
absolutely did. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted by the number of people that are online. We have 80 something people who are participating. And so I just want to wave again to all of you. Are you all doing all right? Good. Look at that. They're committed. I see thumbs up wiggling over there. It's lovely. Okay, last question from us, and we'll go to the audience.
Okay.
So let's see here. At Cal State LA, we're known as an action sort of focused institution. This is a room full of doers, change makers in the future. These are people who want to uplift their communities. So if there was one thing that they could all do today, tonight, tomorrow morning, they need sleep. So maybe tomorrow morning. What would you tell them?
One thing. Well, I guess maybe if I could approach that in a slightly different way, it's okay. Because I think that as I probably said ad nauseum now, like the carbon footprint thing and the start with your I think it's a little bit overblown in terms of it being on each of us individually to solve everything. Fighting for larger scale systemic change, I think, is the most important thing any of us can do. But I think specifically knowing that we're here in Los Angeles and knowing that we're the largest city in the largest state, and what we do here has such profound ripple effects elsewhere. And knowing as well that LA is, clearly known as like one of the most car dependent and freeway dependent cities in the world. I think it's really important for people in Los Angeles to be thinking about how can we restructure our city and restructure our built environment to be more in tune with what's needed from a climate change perspective, from an air pollution perspective, from a housing perspective, which is all tied together. I mean, we really need to figure out a way to reconfigure LA so that, I mean, are we ever going to like get rid of all the freeways and all the cars? Like, no, that's not going to happen. But how can we restructure the city in a way that it's easy to spend a lot less time sitting in traffic on the freeway, where there's more housing clustered together, you know, in dense urban neighborhoods that are served by robust metro lines and robust, you know, electric bus stations, more electric vehicle chargers all over the place, you know, less sprawl, less housing being served by just building out and out into the desert and, you know, into the outlying areas. It's so hard politically because, and I don't know if you guys are, you know, folks who you've all lived here your whole lives, you just got here for college, but it's such a problem in LA where you've got, especially in whiter, wealthier communities, people who are so opposed to new dense housing being built. And I mean, there have been various laws that have tried to address this and city council efforts, but they just, so typically what ends up happening is, you know, a 5-story apartment building with a slice of affordable units gets proposed along Wilshire Boulevard somewhere where, you know, there's a good metro line running through and people, you know, come out of the woodwork in these neighborhoods and complain and they say it's going to make traffic worse and they say it's going to, you know, their communities are already crowded enough. And, you know, some of it is run-of-the-mill NIMBYism, some of it is, you know, more coded with racial aspects and with, you know, economic people who don't want poor people living in their neighborhoods. Essentially, we need to figure out a way to really expand dense, affordable housing and build out transit and build out, you know, other ways of getting around to serve that. We need to make the city more walkable. We need more shade everywhere. I mean, especially in low-income communities and communities of color. Typically, it's again wealthier, whiter neighborhoods that have more trees and more shade cover. We need more public spaces that people can go to stay cool during heat waves. We need to do all sorts of stuff to make the city more livable and less emissions intensive to get around and more affordable to live in. I mean, that's the most important thing that I think LA can be doing to contribute to climate change solutions. And you know, and to go back again to the air pollution aspect of it, I did a story earlier this year. There was research out of USC looking at kind of the inequity between where freeways are built and who's using freeways in Los Angeles. And it wasn't like that shocking a finding. Like I probably could have told you this, but the research quantified it and you know, really firmed it up that freeways were typically built in LA. You know, they bulldozed through communities of color and through lower income areas. And people who drive on freeways tend to be wealthier and tend to be more white people because it's just people who can afford gasoline more, and gasoline's expensive. And so there's this disproportionate impact where you have one group of people polluting more and another group of people suffering the impacts of breathing that pollution. I mean, the LA Times, we did a whole investigation a couple of years ago that my colleague Tony Barboza led that found how incredibly unhealthy it is to live within, especially within 500 feet of a freeway corridor, or as much as up to 1,000 feet of a freeway corridor. Since then, I've tried very hard anytime I've moved to, like, I got to be at least 1,000 feet away from a freeway because that's just so bad. But so I wrote about this study finding that inequity in you know, where freeways are built and who's driving on them. And you know, it seems obvious, but I just, more than ever with anything I've ever written, I just got like totally pilloried in the conservative media that week. Like Fox News did several segments about the piece that I wrote, and Tucker Carlson was like insulting me on the air, and Laura Ingraham too. And just, I mean, they didn't even bother with the researchers because nobody knows them, but you can criticize the LA Times and mainstream media. That's, you know, that's great. But you know, it just, so it was kind of ridiculous. But at the end of the day, it's like, okay, this is just a reminder of how important this is for climate, for pollution, for just quality of lived experience. We need to figure out a way to restructure Los Angeles to reflect some of this stuff. So I would say for people in school here, and especially if you're planning to stay here, like that's one of the most important things you can work on or try to contribute to.
Let me push you just a tiny bit.
Yeah,
because
please.
That's a great response. So like if you were to re-envision the city of Los Angeles, how do these students do that? How do they do that?
That's a good question.
Do they call their elected officials and say we want more population? Do they call and complain about homelessness and needing to build more? I'm just kind of thinking maybe the most important thing is that they register to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it start,
No.
oh gosh, if I had a really good answer to that question, I'd be doing something else with it. But yeah, I would say one, obviously voting, two, calling your elected officials, showing up at city council meetings and at county supervisor meetings and at regional, metro board meetings and telling, letting them hear from you, figuring out which nonprofits and which advocacy groups locally are involved with this stuff and seeing how you can support them if they're rallies that you can attend or if there are letters that you can sign that they're putting out. And again, I know I kind of keep saying this, and it sounds really basic, but I just think it's so important. It's what we talk about. It's what we talk about with the people in our lives and what we get them to think about. Like being clued into this stuff is great, but most people aren't. Most people, for whatever reason, other political or economic or lifestyle issues are top of mind and not climate and not air pollution. And I just think, for folks who are clued into this and who want to make a difference, like it's just one of the most important things you can do is just bring it up all the time and start getting other people to think about it and getting other people to make voting decisions based on this and to make decisions, which nonprofits they're going to contribute to, which groups they're going to take action with, based on these topics.
So I'm going to kind of cut through all of that. It
Yeah.
sounds to me like what you're asking them to do is like talk about this event that they went to today
Yeah.
with their friends and family tonight or tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
And let them know a couple of things that they learned
Yeah.
in this event.
Yeah.
Sounds like a homework assignment.
Sounds great. And again, I'll obligate it to my employer, but get everyone to sign up for my newsletter too. And that'd be,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll make sure. They're gonna see it.
LAtimes.com/boiling. There you go.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, good. I didn't
In
want
case,
to cut that
in
off.
case my editor's watching.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Let's turn to the audience at this point, right? We welcome questions, and I think the microphone in the room actually might pick up your voice. So if you just raise your hand, we'll give you a call on you. It's okay. Small questions, big questions. Go for it. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Brianna.
Comment. In California, I know towards
Off production gas.
Mhm.
I just kind of want how impact how that good tone.
Okay, before you answer, because I'm realizing the microphone wasn't picking up, I'm going to repeat the question really quick
Yeah.
so the audience online can hear. So this is Brianna, one of our MPH students. She was asking, I'm going to boil it down really quick. So Governor Newsom in California is moving towards all electric vehicles, banning gasoline powered vehicles. I think that's a good thing for the city of Los Angeles. Does it set the tone for the rest of the country or others?
Yeah, at a high level, I would say, yeah, it's a good strategy. So for those who aren't familiar, Newsom got a regulation put in place that basically no more sales of gasoline vehicles starting in 2035 in California. So ideally 100% electric vehicles by then. It's not actually 100% electric vehicles. There's been some sort of confusion and misreporting about that. It's really something like 80% would really need to be electric, and 20% in theory could be hybrid electric. So with gasoline engine still, but gasoline and electric charging. It'd be even better if it was 100% electric, probably. But I mean, so far it seems to be taking off. A bunch of other states have actually adopted that based off of California setting the policy already. I forget how many, but at least I think 4 or 5 states have followed our lead on that, and it looks like there are going to be a bunch more that are going to do the same. And I think there's earlier targets. I think by 2030 or 2032, 68% of sales have to be electric, and there's a 2028 target for maybe 30 or 35%. So it's and already, I mean, we're making a lot of progress in that direction. I forget the exact most recent number, but it looks like this year about a quarter of all cars sold in California are going to be electric, which is a huge deal and definitely ahead of anywhere else in the country. So yeah, I think that's great. Electric cars are starting to come down in price, at least some of them. there's all sorts of issues. Car companies have set big targets for producing more EVs, but some of the car companies are starting to walk back those targets a little bit as they deal with supply chain stuff right now and costs rising for the parts. Are we going to get there? Are we going to meet the target? Like, to be seen, but that's definitely the direction we need to be moving in. I mean, I think one of the big challenges it's going to create, and really the bigger problem we're going to have to solve, is making sure we have a big enough electric grid and enough electricity supply to fuel all of those cars. I mean, so much of what's important to dealing with climate change now, and we've alluded to this up here, is electrify everything. Electrify transportation, electrify home heating and cooking. And cooking's a whole other thing. I don't know if anyone wants to ask a stove question, but we can get into that too. But the estimates I've seen are that we need to really double or triple the size of the power grid, and the amount of electricity available on it, which is just like kind of mind-boggling to think about. Like Bill McKibben, the environmental activist and author, has made the comparison that we need something like a well, actually, I mean, I guess Green New Deal has come into term as a term of art now, but for quite a while he's been talking about sort of a not even a New Deal, but a World War II style mentality, the way we responded to like the manufacturing and industrial needs of winning World War II. That's kind of the approach we should be taking to building out the grid and building all of the infrastructure we need. So yeah, short version of that. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. It's going to take a lot of work. You're welcome. Good question.
We have questions going around. Okay, are you willing to? Yeah, over there, wherever.
This is a great dialogue. Trying to restrain my pessimism. You want to help me, but boy, when I think about it, people didn't get it this year. I don't know when they're going to get it. Probably one of the worst years climate-wise we've ever had. Heat, cold, snow, rain, anywhere you go. Really glad that you mentioned policy. Now you mentioned things like the Marshall Plan. It's like the equivalent that the world has to feel we're at war. All of us are on the same side, but we're in war with this thing up there. Unfortunately, we're at war with each other. Look around the world, there's so many countries, including much of the United States, won't get the powerful interests, the autocrats. Right wing is winning elections all over the place. California, where the world, we can solve this problem, but we're a drop in the bucket. How can we move this massive government's policy making that in some cases may have forced they don't. It is impossible to get from here to where we have that changes.
Well, it's a good question. If you'll forgive my repeating a little bit some of the things I've already said, but I mean, one, no, it's not possible without a dramatic change in public policy and politics. Like that's pretty clear. I would go back to what I said earlier, that every bit of warming avoided is important. So, you said California is a drop in the bucket. It's true, but again, everything's a drop in the bucket when it comes to climate change. So every bit that we avoid emitting here, and every other state or nation that we inspire to do even a little bit better, that matters. If we're going to be, in terms of the politics, if we were going to be waiting for there not to be people out there yelling and screaming that it's a hoax and it's ridiculous and that we shouldn't be bothering with it, we'll be waiting forever. There's always going to be people saying that, especially with the influence of the fossil fuel industry. But, no, I mean, I think more and more, even if it's happening too slowly, too gradually, more people are coming on board, more people are understanding what needs to be done. I mean, the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act got passed last year, this major climate bill, like, is it going to solve everything? Absolutely not. A lot more needed, but it was still the largest action by far that the United States had ever taken on this issue. There's the numbers like $370 billion in there for clean energy and climate related initiatives. Like that, is it going to move the needle from where we are now to staying under 1.5 Celsius? Like, no, but it's going to help a lot, and it's going to be better than what came before. So I guess my overall answer to your question is, I get the pessimism. There are times when I share it, But to the extent that there's, good or at least better outcomes at the end of this, it's only ever going to start with us believing that we can, bring something better about and acting like we can. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's what I think we should all be trying to do.
Introduce yourself, okay?
My question is, I'm from Egypt. So we are in Africa, in Asia, we are all our population is rising, gonna be like 2.5 billion in Africa, 8 billion persons in Asia. And all of those need actually also fuel because that's the technology that we have. How we're going to feed them, how the people are going to get
Mhm.
So I understand the message for the existence of improving environment for climate change, but also I understand the struggles I have at home. Need new technology for people. So what is the way forward? How we frame the message of climate change to actually get and actually convince leaders, because this is not even an option over public.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a fabulous question. And like with many of these, I wish I had a really good, easy answer for it. I mean, I think part of what that reality sort of reflects and reminds us is that it's so incumbent upon wealthier nations to just go above and beyond and to really take the lead on addressing this stuff. I mean, the United States has a goal to reduce emissions. I think President Biden set a goal of like a 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 that would be concomitant with, keeping global warming to 1.5 or 2C, I forget. Like, in reality, knowing that there's so much growth happening in the developing world in countries like Egypt and that people have a need for energy right now and have a need, a really legitimate need for energy to, improve their quality of life. I mean, the United States, Britain, even China at this point, like really need to just be going above and beyond and doing more than their fair share, because they have the ability to do so and because they've historically emitted so much of the greenhouse gas that's already in the atmosphere. So that would be one part of my answer. And I mean, the other part is just, and again, global climate negotiations are not my primary area of expertise, so I'm not as well informed about this as a lot of other journalists are, but there's definitely a lot of discussion about climate finance and, what are the ways in which the developed world can help the developing world move more quickly to clean energy. There clearly needs to be a very large transfer of wealth from the United States to nations like Egypt and India and others that are experiencing all this growth, to help them be able to do that as much as possible with renewable energy or with non-emitting energy sources. Absent that, it's like, well, what else are you going to do? It's there's not really another answer. I guess one thing that I would say that just comes to mind based on your question that comes up for me a lot that people always want to ask about is frequently when I write about the need for this like huge industrial build out of renewable energy infrastructure and solar and wind and batteries and power lines and lithium mining and all that, so often I hear this sort of like guttural type response from people in the United States who are, raised not wrongly, but raised and came up with this ethos of not consuming as much and cutting back and limiting our impact on the earth, who just will yell at me about, oh, well, really what we need to do is we need to some people go as far as, population control and limiting population growth. For some people, it's a little bit less extreme than that. And it's more, really, we shouldn't be investing in all this industrial stuff. We just need to be pulling back our footprint and not consuming and limiting our impact on the earth. And it's like, what's always on my mind is the reality. It's like, well, maybe there are communities in the United States that have the wealth and the privilege to be able to think about something like that. But the reality, as you said, is that so much of the world, the opposite is happening and needs to happen. There needs to be economic growth. There needs to be more energy built. There needs to be more consumption if people, you know, to give people the quality of life that many of us are lucky enough to have here. So, so no, there, you know, I know I'm repeating myself at this point, but I think so much of it just comes back to being willing to spend a lot of money, being willing to build stuff, and the wealthier nations of the world being willing to, you know, actually do their fair share of that. Hope that's a little bit helpful. It's a good question.
We'll get
Hi, my name is Israel. I'm a public health undergrad here, as well as a hydrogen technician here at the hydrogen station. I actually have two questions. The first question I have is, I know you mentioned the controversy around hydrogen initially, and the flaws that exist in the component of the production of hydrogen. How do you think that we can protect the system, the infrastructure in itself, so that other states as well can follow along, based on the example that California has set itself? And then the second question I have is, a lot of people, what I've noticed among a lot of customers that we get, is that they actually don't understand true purpose behind actually making the hydrogen vehicle based on Toyota, because the primary focus that they have is Toyota's promoting it as a way, is incentivizing getting the hydrogen vehicle based on getting $15,000 for free fuel, which is the primary focus of why they're getting it. But how can we shift their customers' mindset into understanding the true impact of having on our environment?
You do want to?
You can answer.
Oh, I thought you wanted to repeat them.
Oh, no, he's got the mic.
You got the microphone.
Oh, did he not have the mic? More about hydrogen.
Yeah. So let me make sure I understand. So the first question was about hydrogen infrastructure specifically, and how can we get other.
Perfected so that other states can also follow along our initial motivation to move forward.
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that question. I mean, like I said earlier, it's been a long time and not that much hydrogen infrastructure has been built out, and not that many people have gone in that direction. EVs just seem to be much more, you know, affordable at the moment. You know, I'll be curious to see what happens with this hydrogen hub money that's coming out from the Biden administration now. I just did a story a few weeks ago. California looks like it's going to get a pretty big share of that money. Here in Southern California, SoCal Gas, the big gas utility, wants to build this multi-billion-dollar pipeline called the Angeles Link to help bring green hydrogen into the LA basin to power some of the power plants here that are currently fueled by natural gas, and maybe to bring in hydrogen for some other uses like transportation. I don't know. Frankly, I don't know that we're a good model for it right now, but it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years. I don't have a great answer to it. Remind me the second question.
The second question I have is, how can we bring more awareness for actually utilizing hydrogen itself, rather than focusing on companies incentivizing getting hydrogen free fuel?
Yeah. It's a good question that I don't have a good answer to. I mean, like, if hydrogen could serve as another, you know, good transportation option that was cost effective and that people wanted to get on, you know, and we could build out the infrastructure for it, that would be great. Like I said, I'm skeptical because after 15 years, it hasn't happened yet. But you know, well, I'll be watching to see how this money gets spent now. But I wish I had a better answer. I don't. Sorry.
You know, I realize we're putting an awful lot of pressure on you to solve the world problem. Yeah. So, but thank you for playing along with us. You know, at a minimum, we're mostly looking at information. So you can tell we're seeking answers, and we're looking for someone who knows a little bit beyond what we do for advice.
Only a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So Neil, I know we want to go to some questions online because I see that I'm going to hand the mic to you, and maybe you can read them out.
There's quite a lot.
Pick one or two.
I can go quick if you want to do more.
There's one question about your take on law. Congo, which is maybe complicated. Cobalt is required. And they also, the country of the United States, the most is China, which is the largest player. At this point, we cannot pass policy. So it sounds like the US is supporting these countries and
Question.
Yeah, hard questions. On the cobalt front, yeah, that's a big problem. The import of cobalt from DRC and the labor practices there. We should definitely stop doing that and get our cobalt elsewhere if we can help it. I'm not an expert in that topic, but I've read a bit about it, and it's for sure a serious issue. You know, on the China thing, I'm a little bit more skeptical on that one. It was a little hard to follow just without seeing the wording of the question, but in general, I hear sort of arguments like that all the time of, you know, well, if we can, you know, we can clean up our act here as much as we want, but in a global economy, we're still going to be, you know, if other people aren't doing their jobs, aren't we still, you know, contributing to the problem? And it's like, yeah, but this just gets back to the thing about everything is a small drop in the bucket and everybody needs to start doing this stuff. Like, we are trying to lead the way. We're the I mean, China might be the largest emitter now, but historically the largest share of emissions in the atmosphere have come from the United States. Like, it's very much incumbent on us to go first and, you know, hope and pray and do our best to get others to follow our lead. Would be my answer to that question. I'm not trying to excuse China. They're building all sorts of coal plants, and that's not a good thing. But just because they continue to be a major polluter, I don't think excuses us doing whatever here.
whether or not you it's powered by why
Ooh, also good. Yeah, microgrid is basically the idea that, like, to power a, you know, a specific community or neighborhood, rather than them being like dependent on the larger power grid to send electricity into that area, that there's, you know, like a sort of smaller self-contained, or even if it's not totally self-contained, like a smaller local power grid that can be sort of cordoned off from the main grid as needed and powered by local supplies, by, you know, rooftop solar, a local solar garden, or by batteries, or by other, you know, clean local sources that, you know, can sort of be separate from the main grid. Yeah, definitely. I think microgrids could play a role in lessening stress on the main grid and lessening the need to build out quite as many long distance power lines and build as many large renewable energy installations. Like, you know, for sure. You know, one of the barriers is just economics. Building, there's economies of scale involved. Building larger stuff just tends to be cheaper per unit of energy on average. There are definitely places where it will make sense to have microgrids and where they could provide, you know, economic and environmental and social value. The utility companies in California have definitely played a role in pushing policymakers against that or in slowing it down. You know, you've got big investor-owned monopoly utility companies that certainly favor large stuff that they can profit off of, and who have gone to bat, you know, not only slowing down microgrids, but also rooftop solar. I've been writing a lot about this. There was even in California, which is so environmentally friendly, there have been several big decisions from the Public Utilities Commission in the last few years that the utility companies have pushed, reducing incentives for rooftop solar power, which is not a good thing. You know, that's a complicated issue with all sorts of challenges to be worked out, and I would encourage folks to go read some of my stories about it. I've written about microgrids a bit too, but yeah, there's value to be had there for sure.
Keep it on time. 409. Okay, how about, what do we call it right now?
Okay, I could do a few more if you want.
You can take one more question?
Yeah, let's do
Let
one
me-
more.
You know what, let me give another student who was a little bit shy about asking the question in person, so he emailed it in advance. And actually, this is probably something that many of us have encountered. You strongly believe in climate change. But if you understand climate change, how do you talk to people that don't? And I know earlier you said We're not gonna convince those
Yeah.
hardcore people. But what about the people who are just like questioning?
That's a great question. No one wants to raise their hand and take credit for such a good question. No, honest to God, I really don't bother trying. I know you tried to lessen the question there and make it not about hardcore denialists, but people who aren't sure. When you look at the polls, truly, like the people who are denying climate change, it's like 5 or 10 or 15 maybe % of the population. And these are people who are getting their information from misinformation from conservative social media and right-wing sort of news outlets that are deliberately smearing this stuff. I mean, I just don't think there's really any point in trying to convince people. Like at this point, anyone who's out there who really thinks that climate change is a hoax or thinks it might not be real, like, yeah, maybe there's some middle ground where there are some people here who are like on the fence and could be brought on board, but it's like I just don't see a ton of point in focusing on that group of people. I mean, the vast majority of the American public understands that it's happening and wants to see something done about it. The people who I really focus on, who I think are, if not a majority of the US population, but or if not a majority, are pretty close to it, are people who know climate change is real, who know it's caused by humans, who if you ask them about it and what they'll say, yeah, we should fix that and do something about it, but who in practice for them, it's not a top priority. When you ask people to list their political priorities in these polls, like, yeah, if you ask them, is climate change real? Should we do something about it? Yeah, 70% say yes. If you ask them, okay, which of these issues do you care about most? It's like, okay, it's, economics and the price of gas and immigration and, the war in Ukraine and XXXYZ. And then, climate change is like 12th or 14th on the list or something. Those are the people that I am, most focused on trying to reach, and who I think those of us who really care about this should really be keeping in mind. People for whom they get it at a high level, but it's not in practice a priority in how they vote, how they think, what they talk about, how they act, what they devote their time and money to. That to me is really the key
Yeah, it's
demographic.
kind of like bumping up the sense of urgency.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's so big and so overwhelming. I really think that's why, and I don't have scientific proof for this, but my just dealing with people anecdotally, people even in my in my own family and my own friend circle, I think anecdotally that's what it is. It's just it's so hard to really grasp the urgency of it while not like losing your mind that most people just kind of accept it and move on from it and prioritize other stuff. Somehow we need to get a way to get those people to have this be top of mind every single day, and that's what I'm trying to do.
So this is clearly another opportunity to say, follow www.latimes.com.
Yeah, and keep studying this stuff, and keep taking these courses, and truly, I don't think there's anything more important y'all could be doing. So I'm glad you're here for it.
Alvarez, do you want to say any last words here too about communicating?
I was just going to say your answer is so refreshing, because I've also, in the past, gotten into really heated debates trying to convince people who are identify with more conservative politics, and you really get nowhere. So it's refreshing to hear you say that. You know what? I think there's no use in trying to convince, because that's sort of the approach that I've adopted in the last couple of years, and it's been nice not having to worry about that aspect. But I think there is a lot of hope in trying to get those people who maybe don't prioritize environmental change as much, and trying to have them bring that up a little bit more. I think there's more tangible hope with that.
Glad it's not just me.
Yeah, I fully agree. So I don't have anything else to say other than it's been an honor to have you here with us, and for you to be here and share a little bit about what you do, what inspires you, and so kindly answer our students' questions and ours. It's been
This
really
has been awesome. Thank you for having me here. Seriously.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you, Dr. Stevens, for being the project coordinator for this. It's been really amazing.
We're doing the round of thank you. So I have to thank the Brookhill Student Association, Naomi, Shannon, Emma, Maria Diaz for coordinating a lot of this and bringing them out. And Dr. Zellman, our department chair, as well, for supporting this wild idea. So before we all go, want to acknowledge the people that have been online so steadfastly with the cameras on. I really appreciate you being here. We'll give you a final wave here, but don't disappear because we're all going to take a picture. I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to do it. And thank you everybody for being here in person. Especially thank you to Sammy for spending such a great amount of time with us today.
Thanks.
And being willing to answer so many tough questions. If I got questions like that as a professor every day,
I've heard worse, yeah.
Thank you. Get around.
Thanks.